So this is Caves Beach in Newcastle. This is primarily a painting about horizontal shapes. You've got sky, water, reflections on the sand, and then just the damp sand here. And even the foam is fairly horizontal. I'm just getting where the rocks hit the water first. Then we've got some bigger rocks here. Don't try to draw too much detail on these rocks because they're very dark in the photo, just drawing the outline really. Then we've got some houses. And mostly you can just see the roofs. And I'm going to overlap them a bit, overlap the houses, just I think it makes for a more interesting composition. See how narrow the water is. So it's just a tiny sliver, right? So keep that in mind. Don't bring the deep blue water down here, otherwise the composition just won't look right. These marks are very light, and I put squiggles in it just to remind me that I've got to put lots of foam there. And then again, just light marks here, foam. I'm just hinting at these marks because I want them to be so light that when I paint over them, they just disappear. But these figures are important, so I'm going to put one figure here. So this is about a little bit less than a third of the way in. And we've got some figures here, which I don't mind, just a small grouping. Looks like people playing in the water. And these figures have a little reflection, so I'm just going to just hint at that now, just to remind me, I want a reflection here. The same here, especially this figure that's got a white top on. I like that, so I'm going to keep it. Again, remember, you don't have to put in everything that's in the photo. And then over here, we've got a small grouping, and the figures get smaller as they move further into the distance. Someone with a white top, and a white top. Another white top. The white tops, I'm drawing them in because they're the ones I'm going to paint around. But there's still nothing to stop you putting in a white top with some gouache later. And then the foam comes down here as well. And then we've got some of the drier damp sand here, and then quite a lot of wet sand here. Again, what I want to do from a compositional point of view, this wet sand should be a lot smaller than the dry sand here, or dry-ish sand. So we'll bring that up. Okay, now, while that's soaking up the moisture, for the sky, this is a relatively overcast sky. I'm going to have more blue in my sky. So I'm going to start by picking up my pipette and putting in just a big blob of water for my cobalt blue. And we're going to have some clouds. I'll add a bit more character to these clouds. These ones are a bit plain looking. Again, I've got the land here. I might have a bigger cloud here and smaller clouds here, maybe a small one and a medium. And I'll add some warmth to them. So I'm going to have some permanent rose and a little bit of cad orange. And then for the beach, just some raw umber with a little bit of burnt sienna in it. So for the sky, some cobalt blue. And I don't need to rush this because I'm still waiting for the paper to keep absorbing water, and I can test all my colours before I start painting. And that's pretty good. I want a fairly strong sky. And the permanent rose should not be very strong. It looks strong there, but when I test it on a piece of paper, just by dragging the brush, it's barely tinting the paper. Same with the cad orange. So I don't want this to be so much a sunset scene as just a sky with a little bit more character to it. And then over here for the sand, raw umber. And I'll add just a small amount of burnt sienna. There's all my starting colours. The paper still got a little bit of cockling, which says it can still absorb some more moisture. So I'll go over it again. That's all sitting nice and flat. And the paper is cool, which tells me there's plenty of water underneath, but the top layer is very dry. I'm going to start with the sky. And again, I want a big cloud up here. Pick up my cobalt blue and drag the brush through the edge of the palette and take out maybe a quarter of the paint. And then I'll come down. So my cloud's going to appear above the sky there. And I'm using the side of the brush to help me design cloud shapes. Then I'm going to have a medium-sized cloud here. Then I'll quickly pick up a lot more paint and fill in these gaps. So that's our core sky area. And then I'm going to go in, pick up some of the Wheat Cat orange, and using the side of the brush again, paint the cloud. It's a little bit too strong, so I'll add a bit more water to it. And here and there I'll touch the wet paint, but not all of it. I want to keep some untouched areas. And I'll run this down through the helm. This was a little bit too circular, so I'm just dragging some paint out to the side, lifting some of that. Then I'll pick up a little bit of the pink and go in with the pink. And then I'll go back into this cobalt blue mixture because I'm going to bring that down to the horizon, but I don't want it to be so strong, so it's going to be lighter. So I'm just going to drag some of this paint over here and add water to it. Distant area seems to be some sort of low-lying rock formation. So I'm just going to paint to the top of that. Normally I would paint down to the water's edge. Pick up a bit more of this blue and just to give this cloud some more shape. And that's good enough. And I'll bring the rest of this cloud color, just the dilute color, just down to the water's edge. I'd like that to be a little bit lighter, so I'm just going to pick up the tissue, retrieve some of the paper. Okay, so the sky's done. This has to dry before I can go in and paint this distant area. So what I'm going to do now is paint the wet sand. I've got my strongest mixture here for the sand, and then I'm going to dilute that. Just make some more space in my palette. I'll just put a bit of water there, pick up some of this raw umber and add it to there. It's easier to add water and then add some paint that you already know the tone of than it is just to add water and then try and mix that. I know immediately that this tone is going to be lighter than that because I started with that and just added water to it. This is a bit of a sharp edge. Got a little bit here. If I like that little light wave, I'm going to try and retain that. Make that a bit stronger, so we'll just add a bit of this paint there. And I make sure there's some variation in these shapes. I don't just have one straight line all the way across. Now I'm going into my stronger mix. I'm going to add some burnt sienna to the mix just to warm it up some more. And you can see with all the paint I mixed, I'm very quickly running out of it. Just have just enough. I normally aim to not have just enough. I normally aim to have quite a bit left. Okay, and now before that dries, clean my brush, pick up some of this cobalt blue, but I'm going to bring it over here. I don't want it to be full strength. I'm more after this sort of strength here. And well, I want these colours to merge into one another. Same here, so I'll paint into the wet sand. The edge of the foam is a mixture of sand and sky, meaning wet sand and reflection of the sky. So I add a little bit of the sand colour into my mix. Same here, where I've got white paper, I'll add some colour into that. I'm going to bring this down a little bit more just to make this look a bit more interesting. And here, the paint's drying a little bit too fast. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to cover this part and spray it in fairly close range. I don't mind if I get a little bit of sparkle on that. There, I can adjust that. Probably would have made more sense to paint this first, but it doesn't matter. I know it's going to be a deep, dark grey. So I'm going to get some French ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, and I might add just a tiny bit of turquoise and a little bit of aureolin. And this will be a hint of a reflection of what's up there. And I'll just vary it a bit. And this is, I know this seems a bit weird. I'm painting a reflection before I paint the object, but obviously I have an idea of what colours I'm going to use up here. And we'll throw in a few little ripples like that. Because these are effects that are nice to do while things are wet on wet. I'm just going to soften that. Main thing is to make sure you don't just have one sharp edge running all the way along. And I'll just soften that edge there too. This way, when I come and do the foam, I can get more realistic effects happening there. Figures will do their reflection as a separate exercise. These shapes are a bit too regular. So And what I want to do here, when I look at my reference photo, I can see some darker shapes here, maybe there, and they're useful to add. So just some raw umber and a little bit of burnt sienna. And that's just to add a little bit more interest in this shape. And get my size 8 brush. Throw in some cobalt blue just to dull it a bit. Be a bit thicker. You can't go too thick with this, otherwise it won't come off the brush, but it's got to be enough that it contrasts. And that's just to break up this open space here into hopefully some more interesting shapes. And if you look at it, it's partly to represent dots and dashes in the wet sand. Just hint at that. And that's it to this stage. Now I'll let that dry. So I've just dried it enough, mainly in this area. This way I can be painting and not get too worried about it. This stage we're going to paint the distant hill, maybe this beach and this hill, and then we'll get into the water. The distant hill is just a very pale grey colour. So I've got this colour here, which was what I was using for the water with a bit of the burnt sienna. And that's good enough for what we need. It'd have some cobalt blue, it'd have some raw umber, and have some burnt sienna in it. And importantly, tonally, it's pretty good for what we want way back then. And then for the darker areas in here, I've got my mixture here. So that this already tells me the tone's right for the distance. So in a little corner, I'm going to add a bit more burnt sienna and a little bit more cobalt blue. And I'm going to just hint at those shapes. And I'll add some French ultramarine and burnt sienna into that same little puddle I've got here in the corner. Not too much because I don't want it to go too strong, but there's some areas that are even darker still. Now we're going to paint this area. We've got some green, we've got some roofs, green for the foliage, but very dull, and then some rock colour. I've got this sand colour here, which has got lots of burnt sienna in it. I'm going to just add French ultramarine and more burnt sienna into that mixture. I need a bit more water. And that's pretty good. So that's my darker rock area. The roofs, they've got a little bit of pink on them, some of them more brown, but they're dull. They're not very bright colours. So I'm just going to add a bit of cobalt blue to this permanent rose, maybe a hint of burnt sienna. I don't want that to be too strong, so I'll add a bit more water to it. There's not going to be a lot of detail here. So I've just hinted at the roofs. Some parts of them are going to be darker than others, so I'll just get just the dark grey colour will do. Just hint at windows. You can't see a lot of detail here. They're just little dots and dashes. And then while that's sitting there, I'll mix up some green for the cliff face. And it's not bright, so I can mix it to this dull grey area here, and it will already begin to dull the mixture. I don't need a lot of it. This is one time where I don't recommend over mixing. One, because there's small shapes and you don't want to waste too much paint, and also it's a lot quicker to mix a small puddle rather than a big puddle. So just some aureolin with a bit of cobalt turquoise and some raw umber. test that. So that gives us the green. So just enough to hint at those buildings. Yeah. And normally I'd be doing this with size 12 brush, but it's such a small shape, size 8 will work just as well. There's a bit of green here. Now the photo doesn't show you very much. And I'm going to throw in some of these rocks. These trees here are very dark, so I'm going to pick up some of this rock color, mix it with my green. Then we've got these rocks that run along here. So a little bit of a highlight here, which I don't mind. So just a quick dry brush stroke for that. Just slowly building this shape up. And I'm just trying to give the impression of these rocks. I'm going to darken these rocks down here a little bit more in a minute. Darken this by just adding a bit more burnt sienna and a little bit more French ultramarine. So you can understand the concept. I've got a particular mixture. I've then added more paint to it, so I immediately know it's going to be darker in tone. If I wanted a bit cooler and darker, I'd use more French ultramarine. If I wanted it warmer and darker in tone, then more burnt sienna. And then these rocks in the water that are closer to us, I make sure I just put them in with quick dry brush strokes. So I leave plenty of broken edges, and they'll hopefully will read like foam once I start painting the water. This here is a bit too sharp edged, so I'll just break that up. Just clean my brush. And then these buildings, I'll just get a cool grey. So I'll just look into an area where I've got some blue, bit of burnt sienna, and then I'll just take most of that moisture out of my brush. If I go in with too much paint and I try and paint this with too wet a brush, what will happen is that wet paint will just flow down and move all this paint away. Then I'll pick up some more of this dark colour to just define a few of these roof lines. And that's all. As long as they sort of read like they could be roofs, I'm happy with that. I'm not trying to create every little shape in here, just enough to say there's some flat areas, there's some grass areas running into some rock areas. If we look at the water now, go back to the photo, what I call a steely blue, which is something like French ultramarine with a bit of burnt sienna in it, and then a hint of turquoise as it becomes slightly greener. But that's what we're going to mix next. And I like to do this while some of these rocks are still wet, because when I paint up to them, I want some areas where I leave the paper untouched as white foam and other areas where some of the rock colour bleeds into the water, because the rocks aren't floating on the water, they'll be under the water. So it's okay for some of those colours to mix together. So let's put a little puddle. Again, it's a small shape, so I could probably use my size 8 brush for this. Just some French ultramarine and a little bit of burnt sienna. And that's a good colour. Just here we have a little beach. I'll just pick up some very weak raw umber. I think this is dry enough that I can paint that in now. Maybe a little bit here. I'll just go and dry those two sections, because if I leave that wet, when I paint the water, the blue of the water will bleed straight up. This is just starting to lift. And then as I come forward, I'll add a little bit of cobalt turquoise, and you can see it more in these shallower areas. And the big thing is to also keep some foam, right, which we do with dry brush strokes. We'll start back here. So I've established that distant line. And I'll come down. And create a bit more foam against these rocks. And the odd little white area in the main water. Now, I'm going to lighten it by adding some water and make it greener by adding a little bit of turquoise to it. Maybe a bit more turquoise and a little bit more water. And you have to paint into the paint that's above it so that you get a good transition. paint around one or two of these figures. Quick brush strokes to create the foam. Create more foam than you need, and then you can get rid of any that you think is excessive. And don't worry, if you paint through some of these figures, it's just not a problem. Then I'm going to dilute my paint a little bit. And then got the same paint, but really very weak. I'm going to go into some of this foam here. And then at the leading edge of this surf, quite often you have a little shadow. It's not easy to see, but if you look at it, you can just see how that it's just a little bit darker at the front. In some areas, a little bit lighter where you get a reflection of the wave, but then other areas where the wave just curls over, you get a slightly darker area. So we'll add that. And it just makes the wave look a little bit more real. So I'll just look for any dull grey colour in my palette. And you don't want it very strong, so I'll add more water. And this is one of those times where as soon as it sort of just starts looking right, just leave it. So this area here just has a slightly darker edge to it. Doing some fix it here. When I did the sand in the distance and dulled it, I dropped some water and it started to create a cauliflower. Little shapes like that are very easy to fix, so I wouldn't worry about it. The water along here could be a little bit stronger in tone just to bring out the white. So what I might do is just again get a blue grey colour, which is cobalt blue and burnt sienna. So I'm just doing a glaze, like just painting over the wash that was under there. And then here, I'm just going to just use clean water to soften that. Let me just dry that. All right, so now we'll do a bit of work on the figures. First, I'll work on the figures that are drawn in. And I'm just using this pinky brown color here for their flesh tones. French ultramarine and burnt sienna for a black or a near black. Shadow, just darken on the back of their head a little bit. So I have to remember the light is coming from this side, right? I can tell that with these bags, there's the shadow. I want to make their flesh tones a little bit stronger, so get some raw umber, a little bit of Scarlet Lake. And that's as much detail as I put in. It's enough to make them look like maybe they've got shorts and they're walking. The fact that the leg, the dry brush strokes, that helps to add to that feeling of motion. Well, these ones are in shallow water, so you'd still see their legs. And with reflections, reflections of dark objects will be lighter, and reflections of light objects will be darker. What that means for this person here, their reflection of their dark top will be lighter than the top colour. And that's all because the colours merge with the colour of the water and the sand. Very indistinct reflection. It'll flick like that. A bit of the blue. A bit darker for the legs. Reflections are always directly below the object. So these are the figures. You can't have the reflections of these figures leaning out to the side. And normally the height of the reflection would be equivalent to the height of the figure, except when you get lots of ripples and undulations, and that can make it stretch out. And sometimes I'll just put a little dab there and then just drag my finger along, and that creates its own little dry brush strokes. So I'm just using raw umber and a little bit of Scarlet Lake for skin tones. And I'm just going to use some whitewash. The seagulls in the photo are right at this edge, but it's the wrong place. We'll put it here. And it's best to make them too small and too big. Just a little dab. Leave a little gap. They've got a slight shadow. the reflection underneath will be a bit darker because seagulls are a bit darker underneath. Now I'll just put some birds in the sky. And again, I want the eye to be traveling in this area, so I'll start with a bird over here. I'll make it obvious it's sort of flying in this direction. And then there's a dot up here, which is probably a good spot for a bird. Yeah. If you enjoy this video and have not yet subscribed to my channel, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notification bell so that you'll be advised of every new video I produce. I look forward to seeing you for the next one.